Hey, everybody. Welcome to Terror Talk with Shannon and Cathy.
Hello.
Hello. Today on the show, we're going to talk about the Sims family triple homicide and the Oakland County child murder and the Cathy Barrett butter stealing.
Oh, God damn it.
It's still unsolved, the butter stealing.
I'm looking at the Nest Cam. It's probably Liam, but one of them...
You want to tell people what you're talking about?
Yeah, there was butter left out on the counter because my partner was cooking something. She had to run to the store. And I'm over here recording, and I get a text, and I open it. It's a picture, and there's a lot of dog teeth marks into the butter stick.
Yep.
I'm over it. They jumped on the bar stool, got onto the bar. You've seen our little kitchen bar area where we cook. Liam has a habit of he's jumped up and eaten a stick of butter before.
Sure. He's
12 pounds.
So it was a little bit of a misstep to leave the butter out.
Well, we
as we do.
We are. I had a moment with my partner to say you got to put it on the other side of the counter because he gets up there and
we learn these things.
And Belly has gotten up and gotten a wheel of brie cheese before. So
all the dairy
get up there,
all the dairy.
God.
So perhaps by the end of the episode, that might be a solved crime as opposed to an unsolved crime.
I gotta look deep into the Nest Cam and see if I can make out which one it is.
Well, you let us know because at the end, I'll be following up on that. See if there was any more evidence gathered.
Fuck.
So in that mood, Cathy's going to tell us about the Oakland County child murder.
Well, all right. So I wanted to talk about this case a few years back, and it just, we have so many different things come across our desk that we never got to it. Gotcha. But this case specifically took place in the county that I was born and raised.
Oh, okay.
So I thought that was kind of cool to do that. And my sister-in-law, also born and raised in this county, we became kind of obsessed with it for a while because, it's close to home.
Hometown.
And just like folks who I know who I've met that have had encounters with Ted Bundy, and they're like, I met him, actually talked to someone a couple weeks ago whose really good friend ended up on a date with Ted Bundy. So, you hear these like weird things and you look back and go, oh God, my sister-in-law, I think she encountered this guy's car or something. Anyway, when she was a kid, she's like, that car, I remember there was a moment, it was during that time. I'm pretty sure that's who it was. So, it became a...
Yeah, you get a little bit obsessed when you have these like little tiny brushes with things.
Yeah. So now is the time to talk about it for those people. It was actually a pretty big case. We were obsessed with this case for a long time because we grew up in this area. So from 1976 to 1977, 4 children were kidnapped and murdered in Oakland County, Michigan. And Oakland County, Michigan is like about as white bread suburb. It's a suburb of Detroit. It's upper middle class. Things like this really don't happen here, which I think was another, especially at that time, it was like, what? Why here?
Right.
So for people who aren't oriented to Michigan, Detroit was a different thing at that time. This suburb of Detroit, stuff like this wasn't happening. So 4 children were kidnapped and murdered in Oakland County. The killer was not identified, but was given the moniker the Oakland County Child Killer. So the case drew national media attention. Multiple suspects were investigated, but they never could find the killer. There were 4 confirmed victims, 3 more suspected, and then 3 additional possible victims. So they were all over the place with this. The 4 victims, it was a really strange case. The positionings of the bodies were very strange. The killer had a very bizarre pattern to their killings and would leave them like kempt and somewhere they could be seen. So they would put the body out right next to like a roadside. So someone would drive by and see them dressed like very neatly, like they had been bathed, the whole
display,
thing. Yeah, it was a display. So I'm going to talk about, first introduce the 4 unfortunate victims. They were so young. So Mark Douglas Stebbins, 12, of Ferndale, Michigan, did not return home from American Legion Hall on February 15, 1976. His body was found 4 days later wearing the same clothes he was last seen in, lying on a pile of wood and dirt in the parking lot of a local office building in Southfield, Michigan. He had been strangled and sexually abused with a foreign object and had 2 lacerations to the left rear of his head. Rope marks were evident on both of his wrists and ankles, indicating he had been bound during his captivity. Second victim is Jill Robinson, 12, of Royal Oak, Michigan. Left her home on December 22nd, 1976, following an argument with her mother over dinner preparations. The following day, her bicycle was found behind a local hobby store before her body had been found alongside Interstate 75 in Troy, which is actually the exact city I'm from.
Oh, wow.
And Royal Oak was where I was born. So this is like really kind of nutty. And if those folks that are listening who are on the East Coast or Midwest, we know that I-75 goes like all across that it's a huge interstate. So it was within view of the Troy police station. On the morning of December 26, that's when they found the body. So she had been shot in the face with a 12-gauge shotgun, and her body was fully clothed and wearing the backpack she had taken with her when she left home. Christine Marie Mihelich, 10, of Berkeley, Michigan, was reported missing on January 2nd, 1977, after she failed to return home from a 7-Eleven store on 12 Mile Road at Oakshire. A mail carrier found her fully clothed body 19 days later on the side of a rural road in Franklin Village. She had been smothered to death less than 24 hours earlier, and her body lay within view of nearby homes. So we're seeing a trend of like what this guy did. It's kind of creepy.
Very.
And then the last one is Timothy John King, who was 11 years old. He left his home in Birmingham. All these little cities, too, are very close to each other. Like people who don't know the suburbs of Detroit, these are all within like a half hour, 20 minutes of each other.
No, that's helpful because I don't know the area, and it also just sort of tells you how the person was definitely a local.
Yeah, absolutely. And
Yeah.
that's the thing is, and I'll get into that in a moment of some of the suspects. So Birmingham, Berkeley, Troy, Royal Oak, they're all like Ferndale. They're all very close. Relatively close anyway. I live in LA, so everything feels, close if it's a half hour away, but to people in the Midwest, they're like, that's so far.
That's a whole other
that's a whole other day of traveling. Okay, so calm down, people.
That's how people in the Midwest
I
sound,
have
by
to
the way.
drive 20 minutes. Yeah,
That's how you grew up.
That's like my trip to Target. Okay.
Yeah.
All right. Sorry, guys. All right. Timothy John King. So he was, after he failed to return home, an intensive search covering the entire Detroit metropolitan area was conducted before his body was found on the evening of March 22nd by 2 teenagers in a shallow ditch alongside Gill Road in Livonia. Again, close to the area that we're talking. This is all Detroit metropolitan. He had been sexually assaulted, so there's a trend, with a foreign object, there's a trend, and suffocated approximately 6 hours earlier, another trend. Autopsy results revealed that King had eaten his favorite food, Kentucky Fried Chicken, shortly before his death, and that he was cleaned and groomed prior to his suffocation, another trend. This case sets itself apart from other serial killer cases because the killer only targeted children and managed to leave behind almost no evidence. Perhaps a clue that the perpetrator had law enforcement or military experience is something that they had considered. But also, even though he left no evidence, he was loving this public display of leaving and of look at my trophies, look at what I've done, right? Mm-hmm. So between February 15th, 1976 and March 16th, 1977, 2 boys and 2 girls aged between 10 and 12 went missing outside their homes en route from another location. So that's another trend. They left home, they were en route. And, we have to think about the 70s, especially in the suburbs, everybody rode their bikes and walked everywhere.
Yep.
People still hitchhiked at this time, although that's not what happened here. So just to reiterate how each child's body was discovered in a public area within 19 days of their appearance. The children were all either strangled or shot, with the 2 boys having been sexually abused. Once the victims were dead, the offender dispersed their bodies around Oakland County in places where they could be seen from roadways. I mean, imagine driving your car and seeing a child laying out on the side of the road.
You wouldn't think it was real.
No, you'd think it was a joke, like a twisted joke.
Yep.
The 4 deaths triggered a murder investigation, which at the time was the largest in U.S. history, which I thought was pretty remarkable. So with Detroit's 2 daily newspapers as well as the area's numerous radio and television stations covering the case. A presentation, and I remember this radio station, WXYT, entitled Winter's Fear, The Children, the Killer, The Search, won the Peabody Award in 1977. The murder investigation, like I mentioned, was the largest of its kind at the time, and so they had developed a special task force to look for these children. So during the investigation, instead of finding the killer, because they're throwing out, so they're casting this large net, the task force checked more than 18,000 tips that they were given. That is a lot, which resulted in various arrests on unrelated charges. But here's another thing that they found: the discovery of a multi-state child pornography ring. They eventually turned the case over in 1978 to the state police. So while casting this large net, they start to find all these other things, and they start to wonder, like, is this child pornography ring maybe connected? Mm-hmm. So they were unable to make much headway in the investigation, disbanding in December 1978 when the investigation was turned over to the state police. The massive investigation led police to two people: Frank Sheldon of Grosse Pointe, again, all this is Oakland County, and Jerry Richards, a teacher in Port Huron. Sheldon owned much of North Fox Island, and Richards recruited young boys to fly to the island, according to investigators. And I believe that's where this porn ring was, sex trafficking ring was. So a person claiming to be the roommate of the Oakland County child killer wrote a long letter to a Detroit psychiatrist in 1977. It was pretty nonsensical and looked to be pretty legit. And they wanted to follow up on this guy. They tried to get him to meet. So Dr. Bruce Danto, that's the name of the psychiatrist, he obviously shared the letter with the investigators, and the author of the letter only identified himself as Alan, as he referred to the killer as Frank. So Alan said that he went with the killer when he looked for boys. He's allegedly this guy's roommate. But he said he was not with Frank when he kidnapped the 4 murder victims. So the letter had like all these spelling and punctuation errors, almost like it was written very nervously. This is what the letter said, and it's all the spelling and stuff is off, but it says, "I'm desperate," totally spelled wrong, "and nearly gone crazy and haven't got no place left to turn," Alan wrote. "Please don't give up the killer to the police. You must help me, as there's no one else I can't turn to. This is for real. I know who the killer is. I live with him. I am his slave." So Alan said that he stayed with the children in the apartment in Detroit when Frank would go out and work. So almost like his watcher in a way. He said that the children were gagged so nobody else in the apartment complex could hear them. So Alan asked the psychiatrist to contact him through the newspapers using code words. This is something the BTK did also. And the code words were "trees to bloom in 3 weeks." So according to Ludington Daily News report, Danto received a call from Alan on April 10th, 1977, after they used the code words, and the two agreed to meet the next night at a bar. Alan said he would bring Polaroid pictures that would prove Frank killed the 4 children if Danto brought a letter of immunity, then from Governor William Milliken. Alan never showed up at the bar. So the man Danto said the man sounded very frightened, not cool and composed. Danto told the newspaper, "I don't think it was a hoax call. He just freaked out at the last minute."
Right.
So there was their lead, right? So Frank Sheldon, what we know about Frank Sheldon is he built an airfield with a landing strip, added a docking area, and constructed cabins on this Fox Island. He had a private jet and flew children from Charlevoix to the island, where he had a filming operation for a child pornography ring. So we already know he's guilty, at least of this.
Yes.
Sheldon fled the country in 1976 and was never prosecuted. He died in 1996. Richards, our other guy, was prosecuted for child pornography and has since died. So he was the one that was working kind of in a partnership. So investigators do not believe either man is the Oakland County child killer, but one theory suggests that the killer could be someone they victimized on the island. So that was another theory. Grew up and became that. Detective Corey Williams from Wayne County. We were the first to look at pornography and pornography rings and pedophilia as being a motive in this case. We put quite a bit of time and effort into that. Were these kids filmed? Were there pictures taken? Were they passed around? We don't know at this point, but we did put a lot of time and effort into that. A suspect is not currently named in the Oakland County child killer case. Instead, investigators have several persons of interest in the case, people who may know or at least know of the killer. Many of the persons of interest have ties to crimes involving pedophilia. The evidence tying these persons of interest to the case range from DNA to flat-out accusations, but the 4 victims' parents never got closure to the case.
That's terrible.
Yeah.
Sounds like they got very close, though.
Yeah, they did, and they may have, somewhere in there, they may have named them without us really knowing, right?
Right.
It could have been one of those people.
Absolutely.
So,
Well, thank you.
yeah.
Do we have any updates on the butter murder?
Oh, let me see. Well, when you let me see. I don't think so. I don't know if we're going to know. I might have to be the one that looks back at this ring cam. But the culprit is certainly one. We have 3, and there's a pretty good chance it's 2 out of the 3.
Okay, breaking news.
Yeah,
It's 2 out of the 3.
2 out of the 3 because they've got the greyhound bouncy legs. The other one has dachshund legs. Isn't making it up that
Isn't
high.
going to happen.
No.
Probably just not not as interested either.
No, but the dachshund did grab one of my horse's treats that I had in the console of my car yesterday when I went to take my other 2 in to get their nails done.
Easy pickings there.
I came out and I'm like, where's Lennon's treat? And all of a sudden she's in the back.
Oh, so a crime that was
They're all
solved very quickly.
fucking gluttonous, every single one of them.
That crime was solved very quickly. We are still breaking news on the butter crime. You let me know later. I'll check in with you after we talk
Certainly
about
will.
the Sims family triple homicide. Now back to you, Shannon.
When you say The Sims, I think it's like a video game unsolved crime.
Did you play that video game?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. No, it has nothing to do with that. So on October 22nd, 1966, we are in Tallahassee, Florida.
Of course. Sorry, Floridians, but my God, you're low hanging fruit.
I mean, of course, Michigan. We could say the same thing.
Even our what the hells are Florida.
I know. Jeez. So Tallahassee at the time was a pretty small town. It was about sort of coming into booming town. It was on its way, but it was a pretty small town, and most of the population of Tallahassee was attending a football game at the popular North Florida Fair on this evening. And events like this quite literally left the whole town empty, right? Like that's how small it was. Everybody's at the football game. Mm-hmm. You remember that, right?
Oh, yeah.
Small towns. So the Sims family, namely Robert, who was 42, wife Helen, 34, and daughter Joy, age 12, decided to stay back at 641 Muriel Court. And I give the address because there's actually a documentary called that you can get.
Say that sounds familiar.
That you can get on Vimeo if you so choose, or if you're interested in all the details, like some people are. Now, their 15-year-old daughter Judith Ann was babysitting, and Norma Jeanette, 17, was actually at this game. So while the town enjoyed the game, someone killed the 3 Sims, father, mother, and daughter, while they were still at home. Jenny returns from babysitting, and her sister and both her sisters and her parents just aren't at home. Like, she walks in the house, it's all kind of dark and really quiet. You know how you can kind of tell when there's just no one home, even if you haven't looked around. So she starts to look around thinking like, well, maybe they went out or whatever. And she finds her mother, her father, and her little sister bound, gagged, and covered in blood on the floor in one of the bedrooms. You know, freaks out, obviously. And at that time in small towns, you didn't have 911, you didn't have like emergency services really. So she called the local funeral home and said, that's who you called in those days when there's something happened. Like, they were the hub.
That's right.
And so they answered, obviously, and she said, you know, please come, something's awful's happened, whatever she said. And so the funeral workers were actually the first people on site, and then a cop came in later, and at that time that police officer was actually 24 years old, kind of really new to the job. And you know, you could imagine that in this town, kind of like Cathy's case, it's just not anything anybody was expecting. They didn't know what to do. They'd never investigated murders before. And like those kinds of like really shocking, awful, what the heck do we do kind of deal. So this family is widely known as a nice family, a traditional family. Dad actually worked in tech, which at that time was very rare. He was actually worked in computer development and technology and was a professor and all of this. So he was a technology expert, and that was very rare and very kind of cool. And IT tech at that time was, it's 1966. So it was a very different thing. Mom stayed home. She was known to be a fantastic piano player and very well liked. They went to the local Baptist church, and the daughters were widely known as just nice girls. There was nothing remarkable.
There was nothing that made them stand out victims.
No, it was like, who would want to hurt them? That idea that we often have when we find murders. And in a lot of cases, you figure out like, oh, and then the truth unfolds and there's this whole dark history or what have you. That's not the case here. They were nice people from everybody's account.
Right.
And how they ended up shot, bound, blindfolded, stabbed, like on the floor in their house, nobody's really sure. And of course, at this time, the evidence got all fucked up. And this crime scene.
And this is before DNA.
The crime scene got all fucked up. They ordered a pizza, the whole thing.
They sat and watched their TV.
Yeah, it was not, hanging out. So none of that was going to be helpful because they just weren't used to needing to do that, to solve crimes. But what I can tell you is that there was no evidence of a struggle. I mean, if furniture was tipped over or anything like that, the person must have cleaned up. But
you think they knew them? Maybe?
Yeah, there was no evidence of a struggle. There was no robbery. There was items all around the house that would have been easy pickings for a robbery. There were no forced entry. So that's the idea that Cathy's saying, is that somebody let them in the house willingly. Now, in a small town, was probably pretty common. I mean, it can be common now. You get a knock at the door and people open it.
Yeah.
I don't.
But in a small town at that time, people not like
still
bizarre.
Do it. Yeah, no,
bizarre.
Not bizarre at all to open up the door and let a salesman sit at your kitchen table. Like, not unheard of at all. So did they know them or didn't they know them? I don't know. It's like they want to say, oh, they must have known them, but because of the no forced entry, but I don't know. I think
they have an estimated time of day. Oh, was it even in the evening?
Yeah.
That would be
while they were at the football game.
That'd be a bizarre time though for a door-to-door salesperson to be coming by.
Nice people get hurt.
They do.
That's what I keep thinking. It's like being nice is being friendly to strangers and being innocent in the world is sometimes a lovely quality, but I think it also unfortunately leads to more active victimization in situations like this. But to be truthful, it's like, how would they ever be expecting this? Like where they lived and who they were and what kind of town they were in. No one would expect that someone would arrive on their door and kill them. Like, I just don't think anybody in that town was expecting anything like this. So as far as the bodies are concerned, the 12-year-old Joy was dead when they arrived. The mom and dad were actually still alive, still breathing anyway. And dad was worked on at the scene and ultimately died at the scene after their efforts. And mom was taken to the hospital and was in a coma for about 9 days and then succumbed to injuries. And it was an interesting, like in your case, we talk a lot about trend. Well, you called them trends, but like, qualities of the murders and stuff that are the same. And this person was like, shot him, stabbed him, bound him. At one point, you could tell that the mom or something was struck on the side of the face, or maybe that was the kid. All the modalities were used. It wasn't like a serial murder where you get ritualized things. So that to me sort of says that this wasn't someone who was like going around killing a bunch of people or in a ritualized manner. More like your case sounded like somebody who was going to repeat that over and over.
Yeah.
Who repeated that over and over and over again.
That was a serial killer.
Yeah, this doesn't feel like that to me.
And they didn't take anything from the house.
No. And nothing was posed. Nothing seemed serial killer-esque. It's not to say that this person isn't violent and capable of murder. Obviously they are. But it didn't seem like a ritual killing.
Okay.
What happens in Tallahassee, as you might imagine in any small town, would be that immediately everyone is terrified. So the whole town arms itself. I mean, it is Florida, but the whole town, it's 1966. The whole town starts arming themselves. People aren't going out. They don't want to go to the football games. They don't want to go to church. They're not allowed to walk alone. All the things that families do when horrific things happen in a town you're in. They begin to look at suspects, right? So this is the worst crime that Tallahassee had ever seen. And they begin to try to figure out what the F happened. And so the first suspect that they really had was Dr. Cecil Albert Roberts. And in those days, everybody called you by like initials. So he was known as C.A. Roberts. And he was a pastor at the First Baptist Church. And that is where Mrs. Sims was working at the time. And she had resigned a few days before the murders. And at first there was speculation like, oh, they were having an affair, etc. But what they figured out, or what they believe, is that the days before the murder when she resigned, it was more because she knew too much. Dr. Roberts had been having affairs with a lot of women in the church, outside the church, in town. And what happened is after the murders happened, all of the women he was having affairs with started calling the police and saying, I just want you to know I didn't do it and here's my alibi.
God.
And so the police started going, what's up with this Dr. Roberts person? Like, he wasn't even a suspect. It was that all these women were calling to try to get themselves off the hook because they knew if Dr. Roberts was going to be investigated, that they would be suspect because they were having affairs with him.
Oh, God.
So...
like, that's the worst person to have an affair with. And you're
know.
like, oh, now they're in the media.
Yeah.
And I'm going to be exposed.
Yep. And so they all started calling, and literally that's how he became a suspect, which I thought was so interesting. Ultimately, even though he was a douche, there was no ultimately evidence that he killed the family. You know, that was their speculation, was the motive was that, you know, she knew too much and so he went and killed the whole family. But there was no history. There was no evidence. There was no nothing. He was seen places, you know, it just didn't really pan out. And there was actually no evidence that Mrs. Sim was involved with him. We wondered what she's witnessing that would make everybody so jittery, but we don't really know. So that was the first suspect. The second suspect was Robert Howells, who, you know, this is the one where the motive didn't really like play out. I guess he had a scuffle with Mrs. Sims in the grocery store. Scuffle, you know, obviously that wasn't fisticuffs. That wasn't what was going on, but
right.
Had a little interaction that was negative with Mrs. Sims in the grocery store. And then, you know, okay, so then he goes home and kills the whole family. Now I understand someone who's unhinged would certainly do that. But the motive just didn't really play out. But at the time, this guy was actually was a violent guy in his primary relationships. So he was known for that. And so the people that knew him didn't really feel like that was out of the realm of possibility. And after the murders, here's another thing that's started to happen was that several men in town who were already violent and threatening, started to violently threaten their wives as if they were the ones who killed the Sims family.
Geez.
So this case is most interesting to me because of all the things that kind of materialized afterwards.
A lot of like projections.
It's very small town kind of murder reactions.
What did you do?
They arm themselves. The town preacher is the main suspect, and all the affairs are calling the cop place. And then now we've got all the men in town using this as a gaslighting, threatening thing to their wives. Like, I'm going to kill you like I killed them. That kind of threats. It's like, oh, Robert.
Oh, wow.
But nobody buys the motive at the time. But here's the thing. In the 80s, 20 some odd years later, a letter is found written by the partner of Robert Howells accusing him of the murders and writing all of this stuff. And so they try to reinvestigate, but there's no it just never goes anywhere. And then the third suspect is Tommy Fulgham. And in the 70s, he's 29 years old, but when this murder happened, he was, he was a kid, or not a kid, but younger, 19 or something like that. So in the 70s, he's 29, and he is arrested at 29 and found to have disembodied women in his home, very a la Dahmer, liver in a jar in his fridge, and saying things like, I had to do it because Satan would be chained for forever and he could no longer be on the earth. I was told, like, if I killed these women, then Satan would be chained and wouldn't be able to hurt anybody. So I felt I had to do it. So he claimed possession and devil. He was the devil and all of this. And this guy is found to live like 3 blocks from the Sims. And so he became a suspect, even though the murders have nothing to do with each other. Mm-hmm. But you never know if he was truly delusional. You never know what delusion he had about anybody. So, of course, he lived 2 blocks south of the Sims, and so they had to check it out. But there were no matching prints in the house. They had prints, but nobody, you couldn't match them to him. They hadn't matched anybody to the prints, actually. And the sisters didn't even recognize him. Like, the surviving 2 sisters didn't even know who he was. So everybody's just like, okay. Mm. So then we come to Mary Charles LaJoy, who was a very troubled teen at the time. She was the kind of kid that would break into the funeral home and sleep in funeral robes and talked about death all the time.
Oh,
and
that's like a Christina Ricci character.
Yeah, only maybe not so innocent, right?
Yeah.
Like not so empowering. And she had a friend, I couldn't quite figure out, like a friend or whatever, whose name was Vernon Fox Jr., and they were like each other's only friend in high school and when they were young. And he was a suspected prowler. He was spotted peeping in, looking at Joy Sims, which was, one of the girls. And it was so weird when I was watching this documentary. They interviewed him. Mm-hmm. And of course he denies it, but they interviewed him and he was like, oh yeah, I remember when I first met Mary Charles, we were kids. And you see him get this like far away little stare and go, she was such a pretty little girl at that time. And he says it like 3 or 4 times. Ew. And you're like, this guy is such a pedophile.
Yeah. Gross.
And he was a suspected prowler. Like he would go and peep at people, little girls or women or whatever. This is decades later. Mary Charles says that Vernon killed them. Decades later, I think in the 80s, they bring her in for this interview in the police station. And you can watch it online. And she does a lot of, so if I was there actually when it happened, what would happen to me? And if I actually was involved, what would happen to me? She never confesses. They never find the weapon. There's no real...
Oh, that's bizarre.
There's no real evidence. And at one point in the interview with the cops, the guy starts to say, oh, I know. She asks, if I did this or I did that, what would happen? And the cop unfortunately says, well, You would probably go to, the mental health institute or whatever for a year or two and get the help you need. Da, da, da. And she's like, well, I don't need any help. Like, why would I be sent away? And da, da, da. And then she totally starts to recant, back away from she didn't confess or anything. And she didn't give them any information about herself. She was giving information about this guy, but she wasn't saying anything about herself. And then she never really gave them any hard evidence. And this is, of course, decades after the murder, and it never really goes anywhere.
Well, and she was also somebody that was kind of obsessed with this, like, very dark and macabre, like,
there was a lot of suspicion around, like, the validity.
Yeah, like maybe
anything.
she was obsessed with the fantasy. We don't know, because this is someone who did weird shit.
Yeah, and she was much older, of course, by now, decades later. And it's like, why is she going and entering back into that and, like, selling out her supposed friend?
That's weird.
For the police officers, without a confession or any other more solid information, they just abandoned it. There you go. Still unsolved. We do not know. Possibly exactly like the Butter murder.
Oh, well, I narrowed it down to 12:30 this afternoon.
Okay.
It looks like there might have been a main culprit and then like a sidekick. I just can't tell.
Different teeth marks?
I can't. No, I see two little fawns in that area. One's on the bar chair and one's on the counter, and I can't tell which one is which.
Wow, it might have been both of them.
It might have been.
More investigation. Will you interview the possible suspects later at home?
Oh, you bet I will.
You will investigate their poop, I imagine, and maybe
Belle will shake and Liam will play dumb.
All right.
Yeah.
More to be revealed. Stay tuned for that. Thank you, everyone, for listening to this episode of Terror Talk.
And the Butter Murders.
And we will follow up with the Butter murder if there's any further evidence. I have a feeling it's a cold case now because the suspects aren't going to really talk.
And I just don't have the technology to zoom in that.
Right. Unless there's a poop evidence.
Yeah.
That could actually tip the scales. Thank you so much for listening to this episode of Terror Talk. My name is Shannon.
And I'm Cathy. Sleep safe, everyone.